breakfast, and the airport is closed. He gave him directions to the bus station around the corner where there was a cafe, and Fred says, I'll get around, I'll put on a little light jacket. It was nothing, he says. I got my little cap and I put it on, it didn't even help me in the room. I went to the bathroom and I rolled sheets of toilet paper to stuff underneath the hat to make a nest to protect my head against the cold and the wind. I went outside shivering, the wind was cold, the snow was deep. I slid and I bumped and finally made it around the corner into the bus station, and every stranded traveler in Western Canada was there. Strangers to each other and to me, pressing and pushing and loud. I finally found a place to sit, and after a lengthy time, a man in a greasy apron came over and said, "What do you have?" "May I see a menu?" "What do you want a menu for?" "We have soup." "Okay, what kind of soup do you have?" "You want some soup?" That was what I was going to order, yes, soup. He brought the soup and I put my spoon to it. It was the awfulest. It was the worst kind of gray-looking mass. It was so bad I couldn't eat it. But I sat there with my hand up. It was warm. And so I sat there with my head down, my head wrapped in toilet paper, bemoaning and beweeping my outcast state with the horrible soup. But it was warm, so I clutched it and stayed bent over my soup stove. The door opened again. The wind was icy cold, and somebody yelled, "Close the door!" In came this woman clutching her little coat. She found a place not far from me, and the greasy apron came up and says, "What do you want?" "A glass of water." He brought a glass of water, took out his tablet, and said, "Now, what do you have?" She said, "Just the water." "You have to order, lady." "Well, I just want a glass of water." "Look, I have customers that pay, and what do you think this is, a church or something? Now, what do you want?" And she said, "Just a glass of water and some time to get warm." "Look, there are people paying here. If you're not going to order, you have to leave." So she got up to leave, and almost as if rehearsed, everybody in that little cafe stood up and started to walk towards the door. I got up and said, "I'm voting for something here. I don't know what it is." And the man in the greasy apron said, all right, she can stay." Everybody sat down. And he brought her a bowl of soup. I said to the person sitting by me, I said, "Who is she?" And he said, "I had never seen her before." But the place grew quiet, except for the sound of the sipping of that awful soup. I said to myself, "I'm going to try it again." And I put the spoon to the soup, and it was not bad soup. Everybody was eating the soup, and I started eating the soup, and it was pretty good soup. I don't know what was in it, but I do recall when I was eating it, it tasted a little bit like bread and wine. Just a little bit like bread and wine. Fred Craddock in this story shows how a greasy apron moves from scarcity to abundance. And in so doing, a noisy cafe on a very cold morning moves from a place of earnest refuge and turns into a church. An awful cup of soup is transformed into bread and wine. Walter Brueggemann reflected on the song that I shared earlier. And he says in Psalm 145:15, it says, "The eyes of all look to you. But the voice of fear says, there is not enough oil and we better send the food somewhere." Verse 16 says, "You satisfy the desire of all things." But the voice of fear says, there is not enough food for everyone, so don't worry about the food desert without a Kroger in some parts of the city. Verse 17 says, "The Lord is kind in all his doings," but the voice of fear says, there is not enough health care, we should practice triage on the poor. Verse 19 says, "He fulfills the desire of all who fear him," but the voice of fear says there is not enough education to go around, so we have a new kind of separate but equal. Verse 19 says, "He hears the cries and saves them," but the voice of fear says there is not enough support for all, so no immigrants. Verse 13 says, "He is gracious in all his deeds," but the voice of fear says there is not enough truth, therefore surely Islam does not have any. Verse 20 says, the Lord watches over all who fear him, but the voice of fear says there is not enough grace to share it with the gay community. Now, though this reflection was written in 2012, it still rings true today. This is a concept of scarcity versus abundance. There's this concept in the heart of today's gospel. His reflection on the voice of fear is heard loud and clear in our society today, whether liberal or conservative. The fear of not enough is kind of the basic mantra here in the USA, even in the midst of abundance. While the mantra of humanity in most places is not yet enough. We have never even experienced just enough. It is a mantra of anxiety and fear. It is a mantra of scarcity. And right in the middle of this fear and anxiety comes today's gospel. He comes upon a hungry crowd. Walter Brueggemann argues that when he asks Philip how we shall feed him, Philip represents the church. Where do we buy bread for these people to eat? But John tells us this is a trick question that Jesus puts to Philip. He wanted to see whether Philip understood. He actually hopes that Philip, by now, would understand that Jesus is to enact God's gift of abundance. God's gift of abundance, not just here and now, but in the world. Where Jesus comes, life overflows with well-being, but Philip, the church, doesn't get it. Philip is thinking in old world categories of there is not enough. He tells Jesus, I would have to work for 6 months to pay for the food. We just can't afford it. We can't feed all these hungry people, but Jesus already knows his own capacity for abundance. He knows the source of bread for the world. He knows there will be more than enough, but his church still is trapped in scarcity. Of course, we humans love to rationalize this miracle by saying what really happened was an act of generosity, that the crowd pulls out food that they had tucked away and they share it. But I think this minimizes the gospel. It minimizes the gospel in this message that John is trying to point out of God's amazing power to completely transform human expectations. Instead, we modern self-sufficient types like to think it's up to us humans to handle things and to help ourselves. One commentator observes the power not of God but of shame in this interpretation. That is, getting people to share out of a sense of guilt. God is no longer a miracle worker unbound by human laws, but a social manipulator who reminds people to share. Behavioral modification replaces amazing grace at the core of the story. This is a response that grows out of an attitude of scarcity, in which our response becomes that we must be in control at all times, that we must be responsible, that we must supply our own resources or do not give at all. Jesus is not held down by this interpretation. The gospel of Christ cannot exist in the disciples' response. Jesus moves us beyond a simple understanding of the way the world works. Jesus says, come to the table. Jesus blesses bread. Jesus gives thanks. Actually, the word in the gospel is Eucharisto. Eucharist. Imagine a meal called thanks. Then all were satisfied. And he tells the disciples, get the leftovers. He didn't ask if there would be any leftovers. Jesus knew that in his abundance there would be plenty left over. 12 baskets full. A basket for each tribe of Judah. Enough to feed the world. John tells us this is a new reality right before our eyes. Jesus enacts a new world. A world of abundance. In that old world of scarcity and that fear, there is not enough. And we cringe and save and protect and not share and not let anyone get a free lunch or a free cup of soup. Because we might run out. But in this gospel, we can see the abundance. We are witnesses to what was cast out as our old fears and shows us a new way to live in this world. The old way no longer can hold us captive by fears, for we know an abundant grace that overflows. And at the end of the gospel reading, we see Jesus showing up in an unexpected place. Another word for that is grace. Jesus shows up in the unexpected places. And he says to them, don't be afraid. Because the world is now working in a new way. There is no need for fear. Now, I know our society has taught us to get more and keep more and don't share it for it could be gone tomorrow. The old refrain of fear and scarcity will return to our heads and to our hearts daily. But we have to remember that Jesus has changed the narrative. We are the people who have witnessed and know about the abundance of bread among us for the world. The church is a pump station for abundance that overflows. We do not need to check the economics of it. We do not need to explain it. We need to stand and witness to the truth of Christ, that all our fears which led to our scarcity have been conquered by the God of abundance. This gospel calls us to not be afraid anymore, to live into what the disciples had to live into when he said, take these bread and these fish and pass them out. Can you imagine what they were facing looking at that crowd? God's abundance blessed and strengthened the message of Jesus. So at the end of this, I can only say, be not afraid. Step out boldly in faith. Live abundantly in the grace of God. Just give that extra penny. Give that extra piece of bread. Give that extra minute to your neighbor in need. And just watch God multiply it. Amen.